Good morning. Welcome to Read with the Cows here at New Dairy. We're so glad that you decided to join us for story time in the barn with the cows. Here they are behind us. As a reminder, please leave any questions that you have about the cows in the comments, and we will answer some of those in between books. Okay? So today what we're going to start with is the song that we always start with here during our Christmas season with Read with the Cows. And our kids are here to join us and helping us sing that today. Are you ready, guys? Jingle bells, jingle all the way. Oh, what fun it is to read with the cows on Friday. Jingle bells, jingle all the way. Oh, what fun it is to read with the cows on Friday. Wonderful. I'm so glad that you have joined us. Today we have two books that we're going to read. The first is Mr. Gonopolis and his 12. Was the 24th of the month that did follow November, when the call did go out to one special member of the emergency substitute Santa Claus Corps, and no one remembered it happening before. Old Gonopolis picked up his phone and he heard Santa let out a sorrowful moan. And he heard Santa tell him through sniffles and...
Rejoined, go.
Okay, well, hopefully this live stream continues. We had a little technical difficulty, which often happens. So we'll start again at the beginning of this page. Old Gonopolis picked up his phone and he heard Santa let out a sorrowful moan. And he heard Santa tell him through sniffles and sneezes that Doc Elf had told him it's possibly measles. I do not feel good and I can't drive my sleigh. That means no gifts for the kids Christmas Day. The thought of those children all crying and sobbing fills Santa's head with a horrible throbbing. Mr. Gonopolis, will you please complete my Christmas Eve mission while I'm off my feet? From every small village to every metropolis, there's no one I trust quite like old Gonopolis. Off to his barn, old plowed through the snow, off to the skies, his 12 Holsteins must go. But how can that be, you ask, raising your eyebrow? How can it be that 12 Holsteins can fly now? The adrenaline flowed as they shook with a titter, and each bovine hair on each bovine did flitter. On Bessie, on Bossy, Gonopolis did holler, a woolly red scarf from his hand to each collar. On Jessie, on Sally, on Gertrude and Mary, on Karma, on Clara, on Huldu and Carrie. On Oprah, on Singrid, he yelled with some gust, this old storage box is beginning to rust. Then 48 hooves marched in 2 narrow rows, and into the sky 12 sleek milkers arose. They departed the farm, their tails swaying and switching, while Mrs. Gonopolis waved goodbye from the kitchen. All through the night they stuck fast to their route, flying south to St. Paul and then north to Duluth. The wind blew hard as it waffled and wangled till 12 Holstein cows and 12 scarves became tangled. They twisted and turned and the wagon went spinning. They were locked in a battle and the weather was winning. They dropped through the skies like a bucket of lead. They crashed to a rooftop and crumpled like bread. The force of their landing did cause such a clatter that it woke up the kids and the mom and the dadder. Mr. Gonopolis, his face flushed with red, delivered their presents and then rushed and fled. The dad told their kids then, get back to your beds.
You're not supposed to miss that early on Christmas.
Then once again up again the ladies all leapt, as they still had a schedule which must now be kept. They flew without Singrid, who seemed somewhat dazed. She rode in the back with Gonopolis a ways. They found every house, on each one did each hoof stop, as Gonopolis and cows did sit down on each rooftop. Then out of the wagon old jumped with a calling, and then down the chimney the gifts he was hauling.
You can't see him. Do you know where he is, Pudge?
He tiptoed past rooms where the children did slumber, each foot sliding gently on old creaky lumber, and then sneaking past where the parents were napping. A sound from the fishbowl. The dogfish was yapping. He yapped and he howled and he bayed and he barked while Gonopolis floundered about in the dark. And out of that fishbowl, that fish he did jump. His both eyes were fastened on one tender rump. Caught in the moonlight, those fish teeth were glistening, but up on the rooftop, those Holsteins were listening. They slipped off their scarves and they lashed them together. It dropped down the chimney as light as a feather. Gonopolis saw it, he lunged with a shout, and he grabbed hold that scarf. And the cows pulled him out. He was thankful, I'm sure, and of that there's no doubt. Then out over the ocean they went with great speed, with the Holstein named Clara assuming the lead. Well, their journey was long and the weather was bleary, and one by one each Holstein cow became weary. Gonopolis yelled, "Now you must stay awake," but each joint and each bone and each Holstein did ache. Their eyelids grew heavy and their muscles were sagging, and near the water their udders were dragging. Then at the moment of sheer desperation, Gonopolis was blessed with a near inspiration. "Hey, all yous flies on my cows, quit your napping, open your wings, shake them out, get them flapping." From all over the cows, from their tails to their heads, a gaggle of flies waggled out from their beds. The force of their wings hummed in one massive choir as they lifted up each of those cows slightly higher. But those cows were so heavy and those flies were so slight, soon the flies would be finished, and then so would the flight. Gonopolis was tired, his vision was dimming, and soon Jessie's tail in the water was skimming. At first 1 hoof, then 2 hooves, then 3 hooves were trailing. At first 2, and then 4, and then 6 flies were failing. The cows sunk to their ankles, they sunk to their thighs, as their auxiliary engines were dropping like flies. And then all of a sudden, one of those flies sputtered out, and all you could see left was poor Bessie's snout. And suddenly that was no longer about. But in a few seconds that seemed like 3 days, out of the ocean those Holsteins were raised. Gonopolis and company to Europe did sail, perched on the back of a large friendly whale. Then once again up again, all rested and willing, they flew to the stockings that needed some filling. Then Mr. Gonopolis, his last chimney descended, turned his cows homeward. The mission had ended. They arrived at the farm with the snow gently blowing, and they drifted to sleep as the rooster was crowing. Old Slumber was stolen by a ring from the wall, and he roused from his sleep as he took Santa's call. "I'm feeling much better, my fever has dropped, but we were all puzzled why you never stopped to pick up the presents and the gifts and the toys that my elves had wrapped for the good girls and boys." Uh-oh. The truth hit Gonopolis like a shovel in the head. His knees turned to jello and his face turned beet red. The gifts that he had given were just something he'd found in his shed. Perhaps no one was quite as surprised as young Harley, who found that his stocking was plumb full of barley. Or maybe young Frida, who had wanted a Care Bear, who spent Christmas morning unwrapping a plowshare. Gonopolis was glum, he had failed, he was saddened, till Santa let loose with a laugh, he was gladdened. "Gonopolis, my friend, you're a success, don't you know? It's not the gifts that you give, it's the love that you show. Each child knows you love them, each child knows you care. There is no greater gift you could possibly share Then Gonopolis rested happily after his long, stormy flight, because he knew in his heart that the world was all right. Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good night. Uncle Higgly. So that is a really fun book. And if you want a copy for yourself, please message us, because we have a way that the author has allowed us to be able to get some of these books, okay? So why don't you guys sit down here on our carpet, okay, Amara? Amara, come on, sit over here. Thank you. Is there any questions that we have? No.
I asked the crowd who is their favorite Holstein listening to the story.
Oh, okay. So yes, we've got lots of Holsteins back here. We have
Nativity,
Magic and Mavis and
Nativity,
Mabel, and Nativity is back here. Yes, so all of our cows have names here on the farm. And so I don't know which 12 we would pick. We're going to try to probably name some of them after Mr. Gonopolis's cows, if we have the right cow. So the first letter of the mom's name is the first letter of the baby's name when we name him here on our farm. Our second book today is called The Christmas Day Kitten. And this book is not necessarily, doesn't have any cows in it, but it has a little kitten. And James Herriot was a veterinarian in rural England earlier this century, and has a lot of books with some great stories that I would encourage you to check out and read as a family, little short stories. Not all of them have pictures like this one. They took this one and specifically made some pictures with it. Okay, but I wanted to share it with you so I could let you know about James Herriot, because he is a great fun author. Christmas could never go by without my remembering a certain little cat. I first saw her when I called to see one of Mrs. Pickering's much-loved basset hounds. I looked in some surprise at the furry creature moving quietly down the hall. I didn't know you had a cat, I said to Mrs. Pickering, who was a plumpish, pleasant-faced woman. Mrs. Pickering smiled. We haven't, really. Debbie is a stray. She comes here 2 or 3 times a week, and we give her some food. I don't know where she lives. Do you ever get the feeling that she wants to stay with you, I asked. No, Mrs. Pickering shook her head. She's a timid little thing. Just creeps in and has some food and then slips away. She doesn't seem to want to let me help her in any way. I looked at the little tabby cat again, but she isn't just having food today. It's a funny thing, Mrs. Pickering said, but every now and again she pops in through the sitting room and sits by the fire for a few minutes. It's as though she's giving herself a treat. The little cat was sitting very upright on the thick rug which lay in front of the fireplace, in which the coals glowed and flamed. The 3 bassets were already lying there, but they seemed used to Debbie, because 2 of them sniffed her in a bored manner, and the 3rd merely cocked a sleepy eye at her before flopping back to sleep. Debbie made no effort to curl up or wash herself or do anything other than gaze quietly ahead. This was obviously a special event in her life, a treat. Then suddenly she turned and crept from the room without a sound and was gone. That's just the way it is with Debbie, said Mrs. Pickering, laughing. She never stays more than 10 minutes or so, and then she's off. I often visited the Pickering home, and I always looked out for that little cat. On one occasion, I spotted her nibbling daintily from a saucer at the kitchen door, and as I watched, she turned and almost floated on light footsteps into the hall, then through into the sitting room. Debbie settled herself in the middle of the pile of basset hounds in her usual way, upright, still, and gazing into the glowing fire. This time I tried to make friends with her, but she leaned away as I stretched out my hand. However, I talked to her softly and managed to stroke her cheek with one finger. Then it was time for her to go, and once outside the house, she jumped up on the stone wall and down the other side. The last I saw was a little tabby figure flitting away across the grassy fields. I wonder where she goes, I murmured. That's something we've never been able to find out, said Mrs. Pickering. It was 3 months later that I next heard from Mrs. Pickering, and it happened to be Christmas morning. I'm so sorry to bother you today of all days, said Mrs. Pickering apologetically. Don't worry, I said. Which of the dogs needs attention? Oh, it's not the dogs, it's Debbie. Come to the house. There's something very wrong. Please come quickly. I drove through the empty market square. The snow was thick on the roads and the roofs were surrounding the houses. The shops were closed, but the pretty colored lights of the Christmas trees winked in the windows. Mrs. Pickering's house was beautifully decorated with tinsel and holly, and the rich smell of turkey and sage and onion stuffing wafted from the kitchen, so she had a very worried look on her face as she led me through to the sitting room. Debbie was there, but she wasn't sitting upright in her usual position. She was lying quite still, and huddled close to her lay a tiny kitten. I looked down in amazement. "What have we got here?" "It's the strangest thing," Mrs. Pickering replied. "I haven't seen her for several weeks. And then she came in about 2 hours ago, staggering into the kitchen, and she was carrying the kitten in her mouth. She brought her in here and laid it on the rug. Almost immediately, I could see that she wasn't well. Then she lay down like this, and she hasn't moved since." I knelt on the rug and passed my hand over Debbie's body, which Mrs. Pickering had placed on a piece of a sheet. She was very, very thin, and her coat was dirty, and I knew that she didn't have long to live. "Is she ill, Mr. Harriet?" asked Mrs. Pickering in a trembling voice. Yes, I'm afraid so, but I don't think she is in any pain." Mrs. Pickering looked at me, and I saw there were tears in her eyes. Then she knelt down beside Debbie and stroked the cat's head while the tears fell on the dirty fur. "Oh, the poor little thing, I should have done more for her." I spoke gently. "Nobody could have done more than you. Nobody could have been kinder. And see, she has brought her kitten to you, hasn't she?" "Yes, you are right, she has." Mrs. Pickering reached out and lifted up the tiny, bedraggled kitten. "Isn't it strange? Debbie knew that she was dying, and so she brought her kitten here, and on Christmas Day." I bent down and put my hand on Debbie's heart. There was no beat. "I'm afraid that she has died," and I lifted the feather-light body and wrapped it in a piece of the sheet and took it out to the car. When I came back, Mrs. Pickering was still stroking the kittens. The tears had dried, and she was bright-eyed as she looked at me. "I've never had a cat before," she said, and I smiled. "Well, it looks as though you've got one now." And she certainly had. The kitten grew rapidly into a sleek, handsome, bouncy tabby cat, and Mrs. Pickering called him Buster. He wasn't timid like his little mother, and he lived like a king. And with the ornate collar he always wore, he looked like one, too. I watched him grow up with delight, but the occasion that always stays in my mind was the following Christmas Day, a year after his arrival. I was on my way home after visiting a farmer with a sick cow, and I was looking forward to my Christmas dinner. Mrs. Pickering was at her front door, and when I passed her house, I heard her call out, "Merry Christmas, Mr. Harriet. Come in and have a drink to warm you up." I had little time to spare, so I stopped the car and went in. And in the house, there was all the festive cheer of last year and the same glorious whiff of sage and onion stuffing. But this time there was no sorrow. There was Buster. He was darting up to each of the Basset hounds in turn, ears pricked, eyes twinkling, dabbing a paw at them, and then streaking away. Mrs. Pickering laughed. "Buster does tease them so. He gives them no peace." She was right. For a long time, the dogs had led a rather sedate life, gentle walks with their mistress, plenty of good food, and long snoring sessions on the rugs and the armchairs. And then Buster arrived. He was now dancing up to the youngest dog again, heading on one side, asking him to play. But when he started boxing with both paws, it was too much for the Basset, who rolled over the cat in a wrestling game. "Come to the garden," said Mrs. Pickering. "I want to show you something." She lifted a hard rubber ball from the sidewalk, and we went outside. She threw the ball across the lawn, and Buster bounded after it over the frosty grass, his tabby coat gleaming in the sun. He seized the ball in his mouth and brought it back to his mistress, dropped it at her feet, and waited. Mrs. Pickering threw it again, and again Buster brought it back. I gasped. A retriever cat! The Bassets looked on, unimpressed. Nothing would ever make them chase a ball. But Buster did it again and again, as though he would never tire of it. Mrs. Pickering turned to me. "Have you ever seen anything like that?" she said. "No," I replied. "He is a most remarkable cat." We went back into the house, where she held Buster close to her, laughing as the big cat purred loudly. Looking at him so healthy and contented, I remembered his mother, who had carried her tiny kitten to the only place of comfort and warmth she had ever known. Mrs. Pickering was thinking the same thing, because she turned to me, and although she was smiling, her eyes were thoughtful. "Debbie would be pleased," she said. I nodded. Yes, she would. It was just a year ago today that she brought him in, wasn't it? "That's right," she hugged Buster again. "The best Christmas present I've ever had." And this book reminds us of veterinarians who are so important. You might have a pet cat or dog that you take to the vet, and here on our farm, our cows see the veterinarian every 2 weeks. So every other week, the veterinarian, we have a group of them that are in our area, and they come, one of them comes every 2 weeks to check on the cows to make sure that they're doing well. And just like Mr. Harriet in this story, who's a veterinarian, if one of our cows gets sick on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, we can call them and they can come and help us make sure that our cows are healthy and doing well. And just like this little Buster cat here, if you come visit us here at New Day Dairy and sleep with the cows in the guest barn, you'll probably meet some of our cats, because we also have some pretty fun cats here on the farm that people like to meet when they're here on the farm. Do we have any other questions? Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today for Read with the Cows here in the barn. You can join us here again next week on Fridays. Can't believe I forgot. Fridays at 9 a.m. And to help us remember, we'll finish our time together with a song, okay? Jingle bells, jingle all the way. Oh, what fun it is to read with the cows on Friday. Jingle bells, jingle all the way. Oh, what fun it is to read with the cows on